Blood trickled down Katherine Campbell's chin as she staggered through the dusty streets of Promise Creek, Montana, clutching her bruised ribs and praying no one would notice the purple welts blooming beneath her threadbare sleeve. It was 1876, a year since she'd foolishly married Jeremiah Reeves, a man whose sweet words had turned bitter faster than milk in August heat. Katherine ducked behind the general store, pressing her back against rough wooden boards as she caught her breath. The morning sun had barely cleared the eastern mountains, but Jeremiah would be waking soon. He'd find her gone, and the consequences would be unbearable. She needed to put miles between them before he realized she'd finally gathered the courage to flee. "You look like you could use some help, madam." Katherine startled, nearly crying out as pain shot through her ribs. A tall man stood at the corner of the building, his features shadowed beneath a well-worn Stetson. His voice was deep but gentle, lacking the edge that had become so familiar in Jeremiah's tone. "I'm fine," she managed, straightening despite the agony it caused. "Just clumsy is all." The man stepped closer, and Katherine instinctively backed away. In the growing light, she could see his face clearly now, kind eyes the color of whiskey, a strong jaw covered with stubble, and a mouth that seemed more accustomed to smiling than scowling. "Name's Preston Vance," he said, keeping his distance as if sensing her fear. "And with all due respect, madam, you don't look fine." "You don't know me," Katherine whispered, eyes darting toward the street. "Any minute now Jeremiah might appear." "No," Preston agreed, "but I know trouble when I see it, and I've got a wagon headed out to my ranch this morning. Could use some help with cooking for my ranch hands this season. Paid work if you're interested." Katherine's heart hammered in her chest. A way out. A legitimate reason to be gone when Jeremiah came looking. But she'd trusted a man once before, and that had led her here bruised and desperate in a back alley. "Why would you help a stranger?" she asked warily. Preston adjusted his hat, looking uncomfortable. "Let's just say I've seen what angry men can do to those who can't fight back. My ranch is 15 miles outside town, far enough that troubles have a hard time finding their way there." A shout from down the street made Katherine flinch. She didn't need to look to know it was Jeremiah. "I don't have anything," she said quickly. "Just need willing hands and someone who can make a decent pot of coffee," Preston replied, already turning toward the livery. "Wagon leaves in 10 minutes. Your choice, madam." Katherine stood frozen for 3 precious seconds before making the decision that would change her life. She followed him, keeping to shadows, aware that she was either walking toward salvation or another kind of hell. Preston's wagon was loaded with supplies: flour, coffee beans, salted meat, and tools. The driver, an older man with white hair and weathered skin, nodded respectfully as Preston helped Katherine onto the bench seat. "This is Hank," Preston said. "Been with me since I bought the Broken Arrow 5 years ago." "Madam," Hank acknowledged, not asking questions about her bruised face or the way she held her arm protectively over her ribs. As the wagon pulled away from Promise Creek, Katherine kept her head down, terrified of seeing Jeremiah's fury-filled face. Only when the town disappeared behind a bend in the road did she allow herself a shallow breath. "Thank you," she whispered, the words strange on her tongue. Gratitude had become an unfamiliar sensation. "Don't thank me yet," Preston said, riding alongside on a chestnut mare. "Ranch life isn't easy. Days start before dawn and end long after sunset." Katherine almost laughed. "Mr. Vance, I've been living in hell. Hard work sounds like heaven by comparison." The journey to the Broken Arrow Ranch passed in silence. Katherine fought against exhaustion, knowing that sleep would bring vulnerability. Instead, she focused on the rolling grasslands, the distant mountains, and the occasional stands of pine and aspen that dotted the landscape. As the wagon crested a final hill, the ranch spread before them a collection of sturdy log buildings surrounding a main house, corrals filled with horses, and in the distance, cattle grazing on spring grass. "It's not much," Preston said, misreading her wide-eyed stare, "but it's peaceful." Katherine couldn't remember the last time she'd experienced peace. The concept seemed as foreign as the stars. The ranch house kitchen was larger than Katherine expected, with a massive iron stove, a wooden table that could seat 12, and shelves lined with provisions. Mrs. Winters, the previous cook, had left 2 weeks earlier to care for her ailing sister in Virginia, leaving Preston and his 7 ranch hands to fend for themselves. "Men can survive on their own cooking for a spell," Preston explained as he showed her around, "but morale suffers something fierce. Good food keeps good men loyal." Katherine nodded, already assessing what she had to work with. Cooking was something she knew. Before marrying Jeremiah, she'd helped in her parents' boarding house in Ohio until they died of fever 3 years ago, leaving her alone and vulnerable to Jeremiah's false promises. "There's a room off the kitchen," Preston continued. "Small but private. No one will bother you there." The room was indeed small, but it had a real bed with clean linens, a washstand with a porcelain basin, and a window that looked out over a kitchen garden gone slightly wild with neglect. "It needs tending," Preston said, following her gaze to the garden. Mrs. Winters was getting on in years. Couldn't kneel to weed proper anymore. Katherine's fingers itched to sink into soil again. "I could manage it if you'd like. Fresh vegetables would be good for the men." Preston smiled, a genuine expression that transformed his weather-worn face. "I reckon that would be appreciated." He paused at the doorway. "I'll let you get settled. Dinner's usually at sundown. Men will be in from the range by then." When he left, Katherine sank onto the bed, wincing at the pain in her ribs. For the first time in months, she was alone without fear. The tears came then, silent. Hot tracks down her cheeks that she'd been too afraid to shed in Jeremiah's presence. She didn't know if she could trust Preston Vance, but for now she had shelter, purpose, and 15 miles between herself and the man who had methodically destroyed every part of her that once felt joy. That evening, Katherine served a simple meal of beans, salt pork, and fresh biscuits. The ranch hands, a mix of ages and backgrounds, were respectful if curious about the bruised woman serving their food. No one asked questions, though she caught sympathetic glances from the older men and uncertain ones from the younger. Preston introduced her only as Miss Katherine, our new cook, offering no explanation for her condition. The men accepted this with nods and murmured thanks for the food. After dinner, when the men had filed out to the bunkhouse and Preston remained at the table with a cup of coffee, Katherine finally spoke. "They're wondering about me." Preston looked up, those whiskey-colored eyes steady. "Folks around here mind their business unless invited to do otherwise." "And you?" Katherine asked, her voice stronger than she felt. "Aren't you curious why a beaten woman would run without even a change of clothes?" He set his cup down carefully. "I reckon everyone's got a past they'd rather not talk about. When you're ready to share yours, I'll listen. Until then, you're safe here." "He'll come looking," she said, the fear never far from her thoughts. "Jeremiah doesn't like losing things he considers his property." Preston's jaw tightened, but his voice remained even. "Then he'll have to deal with me and 7 men who don't take kindly to someone threatening our cook." Katherine wanted to believe him, wanted desperately to think that this remote ranch could be a sanctuary. But Jeremiah had found her the last time she tried to leave, hiding at a friend's home in town. The consequences had been severe. "Get some rest," Preston said, rising from the table. "Morning comes early around here." Katherine watched him leave, wondering if she'd made another terrible mistake or found an unexpected salvation. The next weeks passed in a rhythm of work that, while exhausting, brought Katherine a measure of peace she'd thought lost forever. She rose before dawn to stoke the stove and prepare breakfast for men who thanked her politely for every meal. During the day, she baked bread, prepared dinner, and slowly reclaimed the kitchen garden, coaxing new life from soil that had been neglected. Preston was often gone from sunup to sundown, returning with dust on his clothes and weariness etched in the lines around his eyes. He never complained, ate whatever she set before him with appreciation, and always thanked her before retiring to his room in the east wing of the house. Sometimes in the evening, he would linger over coffee, telling her about the day's work or asking gentle questions about her cooking techniques. Never once did he ask about her bruises, which were slowly fading, or the husband she'd fled. It was Preston who found her one evening, kneeling in the garden, tears streaming down her face as she pulled weeds with shaking hands. "Katherine." His voice was soft, concerned. She hadn't heard him approach, too lost in memories triggered by the date. 1 year ago today, she had married Jeremiah, believing his promises of love and security. "It's nothing," she said, hastily wiping her cheeks with soil-stained hands. "Just being foolish." Preston crouched beside her, careful to maintain a respectful distance. "I found that tears usually mean something important." Katherine stared at the young tomato plant she'd been tending, its fragile stem now supported by a small stake. "Today is my wedding anniversary," she admitted. "I was remembering how easily I believed in something that turned out to be a lie." Preston was silent for a moment. "Some plants look healthy on the surface but have rot at the roots. Doesn't mean all plants are diseased." She glanced at him, surprised by the metaphor. "Are you a philosopher, Mr. Vance?" The corner of his mouth lifted. "Just a man who's seen both good and bad grow from the same soil." He hesitated. Would it help to talk about it? What happened? Katherine had kept the full story locked inside, ashamed of her naivety and fear. But here, in the quiet garden with twilight softening the world around them, the words finally came. "After my parents died, I was alone in a boarding house I couldn't maintain by myself. Jeremiah Reeves came through town, selling farm equipment. He was charming, attentive. Said all the things a lonely girl wants to hear." She pulled another weed, focusing on its roots. "We were married within a month. By the time we reached Montana, he'd changed, or maybe he just stopped pretending." Preston remained still, listening. "The first time he hit me was over spilled coffee. I apologized, cleaned it up, thought it was a momentary anger. The second time was for speaking to a man on the street too long. Then it became punishment for imagined slights, for meals not perfect enough, for breathing too loudly when he had a headache." Katherine's voice grew steadier as she continued, the relief of speaking the truth overwhelming her shame. "I tried to leave once before. He found me, brought me back, broke 2 of my ribs to teach me loyalty." Preston's hands clenched, but his voice remained gentle. "And this time, he would have killed me. He was drinking more, angry about debts. I knew I wouldn't survive another winter with him." She looked up, meeting Preston's gaze directly. "I'd rather die running than live another day as his property." "You won't have to," Preston said, the words a quiet promise. "This can be your home for as long as you want it." Something warm unfurled in Katherine's chest, not hope exactly, but perhaps its precursor. "Thank you," she whispered. Preston stood, offering his hand to help her up. Katherine hesitated only briefly before accepting it, noticing how carefully he held her, as if she were made of something precious and fragile. That night, for the first time since arriving at the Broken Arrow, Katherine slept without nightmares. June melted into July, bringing relentless heat and long days of haying. Catherine's bruises faded completely, and the constant work added healthy weight to her once gaunt frame. The kitchen garden flourished under her care, providing fresh vegetables that the ranch hands praised with enthusiasm. She began to know the men as individuals: Hank, with his endless repertoire of tall tales; young Tommy, barely 18 and eager to prove himself; Diego, whose skilled hands could gentle the wildest horse; old Marcus, who had fought in the war and carried both physical and invisible scars; and Preston. Reserved yet kind, he never raised his voice, never made demands, and always treated her with a respect she'd forgotten she deserved. Sometimes she caught him watching her when he thought she wouldn't notice, a look in his eyes that made her both nervous and curiously warm. The relative peace was shattered one scorching afternoon when Katherine was alone at the ranch, the men all out repairing a broken fence line. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made her look up from her bread-making, flour dusting her hands as she peered out the window. Her heart stopped. Jeremiah. He dismounted in the yard, his face red with heat and anger. Catherine's hands trembled as she quickly searched for a weapon, finally grasping a heavy iron skillet. The door crashed open. "There you are, you ungrateful whore," Jeremiah snarled, filling the doorframe with his bulky frame. "Took me long enough to find where you'd been hiding." Katherine lifted the skillet, her voice steadier than her hands. "Leave, Jeremiah. I'm not going back with you," he laughed, an ugly sound that once had power to paralyze her with fear. "That's not your decision to make, wife. You belong to me by law." "I belong to myself," Katherine said, backing toward the stove, "and I'd rather die than go anywhere with you." Jeremiah's face darkened. "That can be arranged." He lunged forward, faster than his size suggested possible. Katherine swung the skillet, connecting with his shoulder. Jeremiah howled in pain but managed to grab her wrist, twisting until she cried out and dropped her weapon. His other hand closed around her throat. "I'm going to teach you what happens to wives who don't know their place," he growled, tightening his grip. Katherine clawed at his hand, black spots dancing at the edges of her vision. Just as consciousness began to fade, a deafening crack split the air. Jeremiah's grip loosened, his eyes widening in surprise before he crumpled to the floor. Behind him stood Preston, rifle in hand, smoke still curling from the barrel. He'd fired into the ceiling, the bullet splintering a beam above. "Step away from her," Preston said, his voice colder than Katherine had ever heard it. Jeremiah staggered to his feet, turning to face the new threat. "This isn't your business, cowboy. That's my wife you're harboring." Preston's eyes never left Jeremiah's face as he slowly lowered the rifle to point at the intruder's chest. "I'm making it my business, and she's not going anywhere she doesn't want to go." Behind Preston, Katherine could see the other ranch hands filing in, each armed and grim-faced. Jeremiah must have noticed too, because he took a step back, calculating his odds. "The law's on my side," Jeremiah said, though uncertainty had crept into his tone. "A man has rights to his wife." "And a woman has the right not to be beaten," Preston replied evenly. "Now you've got two choices. Ride out of here and never come back, or I'll have the boys dig a grave behind the barn. No one would question another anonymous burial in these parts." The threat hung in the air, deadly serious despite the casual delivery. Jeremiah's eyes darted between Preston's steady rifle and the circle of hardened men blocking his escape. "She's not worth the trouble anyway," he finally muttered, his bravado crumbling. "Used goods." Preston's finger tightened on the trigger. "Choose your next words very carefully." Something in Preston's expression must have convinced Jeremiah of his sincerity. He raised his hand slightly. "I'm leaving, but this isn't over." "It is," Preston said. Diego, Tommy, escort Mr. Reeves to the property line. Make sure he understands the boundaries. The two men moved forward, flanking Jeremiah, whose face twisted in impotent rage. As they marched him outside, he threw one last venomous look at Katherine. "You'll regret this." Only when Jeremiah was gone did Katherine's legs give way. Preston was at her side instantly, catching her before she hit the floor. "You're safe," he murmured, guiding her to a chair. "He's gone, and he won't be back." Katherine's hands shook uncontrollably as Hank pressed a cup of water into them. "How did you know?" she asked. "Tommy spotted a rider asking questions at the Henderson place yesterday," Preston explained. "When we realized who it might be, we headed back." His jaw tightened. "I'm sorry we weren't here sooner." "You came," Katherine said simply, the reality of her narrow escape settling in. "You all came." The men shuffled awkwardly, uncomfortable with her gratitude. One by one they filed out, leaving her alone with Preston, who knelt before her chair, his eyes searching her face. "Are you hurt?" he asked softly. She touched her throat, wincing at the tenderness where Jeremiah's fingers had pressed. "I'll be all right." Preston nodded, though the anger hadn't left his eyes. "Katherine, I need to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly." She tensed, afraid of what might come next. "Do you want to stay here? Not just until you heal or feel safe, but permanently?" The question caught her off guard. "As your cook, you mean?" Something flickered across Preston's face, uncertainty, perhaps, or vulnerability. "As whatever you want to be." "I'm not offering charity or temporary shelter. I'm offering a home if you want it." Katherine studied him, this man who had saved her in more ways than one. "Why?" Preston ran a hand through his hair, suddenly looking younger and less sure of himself. "Because in 3 months, you've brought more life to this place than I've seen in 5 years. Because the garden isn't the only thing that's started growing again since you arrived." He took a deep breath. "I'm not asking for anything you're not ready to give. There's no obligation or expectations. I want you to stay, Katherine. I want to see what might grow between us if you're willing." Katherine felt tears prick her eyes, but they weren't born of fear or sadness. For the first time in years, she felt something unfurling inside her chest, a tendril of hope reaching toward the light. "I'd like to stay," she whispered, her voice gaining strength. "I'd like to see what might grow too." Preston's smile was like sunrise after the longest night. Slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, he reached for her hand. Katherine met him halfway, their fingers intertwining in a promise neither spoke aloud. August brought thunderstorms that cooled the parched land and filled the creek beds. Katherine's garden thrived, producing more than the ranch could consume. She began preserving vegetables for winter, filling the pantry with jewel-toned jars that glinted in the lamplight. Her relationship with Preston developed with the same careful tending she gave her garden. There were no grand declarations or hasty advances, just a gradual deepening of trust and understanding. Some evenings they would sit on the porch, watching lightning illuminate distant mountains, talking of small things and, occasionally, the deeper fears that still haunted Katherine's dreams. "I keep expecting him to return," she admitted one night, as thunder rolled across the valley. "To finish what he started." Preston's hand found hers in the darkness. "The sheriff in Promise Creek knows the situation now. Jeremiah shows his face in the county again. He'll find himself in a cell." Katherine nodded, though the reassurance only partially eased her worry. "It's not just Jeremiah, it's me, the woman who let it happen, who was too afraid to leave until it was almost too late." Preston turned to face her, his expression serious in the flickering lamplight. "You survived, Katherine. That takes more courage than most people will ever know." "I don't feel brave," she confessed. "I feel broken, like something inside me is permanently damaged." Broken doesn't mean ruined, Preston said softly. Some of my best horses were broken when I got them mistreated, fearful. But with time and patience, they learned to trust again. He paused. The wildflowers that grow in the fields after a fire, they're not despite the burning, but because of it. Some seeds need that heat to open. Katherine felt tears threaten again. They came more easily now, these emotions she'd suppressed for so long. How did you get so wise about broken things, Preston Vance? Something shadowed his eyes. Because I was one. He rarely spoke of his past, and Katherine had never pushed, respecting his privacy as he respected hers. But tonight, as rain began to patter against the roof, Preston told her about the boy who had watched his father beat his mother for years, powerless to stop it, until he was finally big enough to stand between them. How his father had left, taking everything of value and leaving Preston and his mother destitute. How he had worked any job he could find to keep them fed until consumption took her when he was 20. I promised her I'd make something of myself, Preston said, his voice rough with memory. That I'd build a place where people felt safe. It took 10 years of working other men's land before I could buy this ranch, but every day I try to honor that promise. Katherine understood then why he had stopped to help a bruised stranger behind a general store. Why the men who worked for him were so loyal. Why the Broken Arrow felt more like a home than anywhere she had ever lived. Slowly, carefully, she leaned her head against his shoulder. Preston's arm came around her, gentle and undemanding. "Thank you for telling me," she whispered. "Thank you for staying," he replied, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. The moment was simple, profound, and healing in ways neither could have articulated. Two broken people, finding in each other not just the pieces they'd lost, but something entirely new and stronger. September brought the first hints of autumn, cooler nights and golden light that made the world seem painted in honey. Katherine celebrated her 23rd birthday with a cake she baked herself, and a gift from Preston, a silver locket containing a pressed wildflower from the meadow behind the house. "So you always remember that beautiful things can grow in unexpected places," he said as he fastened it around her neck, his fingers brushing her skin in a touch that sent warmth through her entire body. That night, for the first time, Katherine kissed him, a tentative press of lips that quickly deepened into something that made her realize how much she had been waiting for this moment. Perhaps since that first day when he had offered her escape. October brought the cattle drive, taking Preston and most of the men away for 2 weeks. Katherine kept busy, deep cleaning the ranch house and putting up the last of the garden's bounty. She found herself lingering in Preston's room, running her fingers over his books, breathing in the scent of leather and pine that seemed to cling to everything he owned. When hoofbeats announced the men's return, Katherine ran to the porch, heart pounding with an anticipation that had nothing to do with fear. Preston dismounted wearily, his face sunburned and stubbled, but his eyes lit up when he saw her waiting. "Welcome home," she said, the words carrying more meaning than they ever had before. That night, after the men had eaten their fill and retired to the bunkhouse with contented groans, Preston took Katherine's hand and led her to the porch swing. "I missed you," he said simply. "I missed you too," she replied, realizing how true it was. The ranch had felt empty without him, despite all the work that had filled her days. Preston seemed nervous, uncharacteristically fidgeting with the brim of his hat. "I've been thinking during those long nights on the trail, about us. About what I want for the future." Katherine felt a flutter of anxiety. "And what did you decide?" He set his hat aside, taking both her hands in his. "I decided that I've fallen in love with you, Katherine Campbell, that I want to spend my life with you if you'll have me. Not as my cook or my housekeeper, but as my wife and partner in everything." Catherine's breath caught in her throat. The word wife had become something fearful, associated with ownership and pain. But coming from Preston, it sounded different, like an invitation rather than a demand. "I know what your marriage was," he continued, reading her hesitation. "I would never ask you to enter another unless you were certain it would be different. I don't want to own you, Katherine. I want to walk beside you." Tears welled in her eyes, but they were the kind that healed rather than hurt. "I love you too," she whispered, the words feeling both foreign and completely right on her tongue. "But I'm afraid." "Of what?" he asked gently. "Of trusting this happiness. Of believing I deserve it." Preston's hands tightened around hers. "You deserve everything good in this world, Katherine, but I understand fear. There's no rush. We have time." Katherine looked at this man who had saved her life, then taught her how to live it again. Who had shown her that patience and kindness weren't weaknesses but the greatest strengths. Who had never once made her feel like property or less than his equal. "Yes," she said, the decision crystallizing with sudden clarity. "I will marry you, Preston Vance." His smile was like breaking dawn. "Are you sure?" In answer, Katherine leaned forward and kissed him, pouring all her newfound courage and hope into the gesture. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, Preston pressed his forehead against hers. "When?" he asked. "Soon," she replied. "Before the first snow." They were married on a crisp November morning with gold and crimson leaves carpeting the ground. The ceremony was small, just the ranch hands and a few neighbors as witnesses, with the circuit preacher presiding. Katherine wore a new dress of deep blue, with Preston's locket around her neck and wildflowers in her hair. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Katherine felt no fear, only a profound sense of rightness as Preston's lips met hers in a kiss that promised a lifetime of respect, partnership, and love. The celebration afterward was boisterous, with food, music, and dancing that continued well into the night. As darkness fell, Preston led Katherine away from the revelry, toward the small cabin he had been secretly building at the edge of the property, their own space, separate from the main house, where they could begin their life together. Inside, a fire crackled in the hearth, illuminating simple but beautiful furnishings: a bed with a handmade quilt, a table with 2 chairs, bookshelves already filled with volumes, and a window box where, Preston explained, Katherine could start seedlings come spring. "It's perfect," she whispered, taking in the home he had created for them. "Not yet," Preston said, "but it will be. We'll make it that way together." That night, as they lay in each other's arms, Katherine realized that the broken parts of herself hadn't disappeared, they had been transformed, integrated into something stronger and more beautiful than before. Like the wildflowers that bloomed after fire, like the garden that flourished under her care, she had not merely survived but found a way to thrive. "What are you thinking?" Preston murmured against her hair. Katherine smiled in the darkness. "That broken things can still bloom." "They bloom the brightest," he agreed, pulling her closer. "Because they know what it means to survive the breaking." Outside, the first snowflakes of winter began to fall, covering the land in a blanket of white that promised renewal when spring returned. Inside the cabin, Katherine and Preston Vance slept peacefully. 2 once broken souls who had found in each other not just healing, but a love that would continue to grow, season after season, for all the years to come. Spring arrived early the following year, bringing with it green shoots in Katherine's garden, and the news that their family would grow by one come autumn. As Preston knelt beside her in the soil, helping her plant tomato seedlings, his hand occasionally straying to the gentle curve of her stomach, Katherine reflected on the journey that had brought her here. From the terrified woman hiding behind a general store to the confident wife and expectant mother tending her garden at the Broken Arrow Ranch, She had traversed a distance measured not in miles but in healing. The scars remained both seen and unseen, but they no longer defined her. "What shall we name her?" Preston asked, his eyes crinkling with happiness as he patted soil around a fragile plant. Katherine laughed. "You sound very certain." "Just a feeling," he replied with a smile. "A daughter as strong and beautiful as her mother." Katherine leaned into his embrace, marveling at how touch had transformed from something to fear into something that brought comfort and joy. "Hope," she said after a moment's thought. "I'd like to call her Hope." Preston nodded, understanding the significance. "Hope Vance. It's perfect." As they continued working side by side in the garden, Katherine thought about the seeds they were planting both in the soil and in their lives together. Some would face storms, some might struggle, but with proper care and patience, they would grow into something beautiful, like her, like Preston, like the love that had bloomed between two broken souls who had found in each other not just refuge, but the strength to flourish.